There is a place in northern Wyoming where people arrived, looked at the ground, and said something that historians are still trying to explain. 9,642 feet up, on the shoulder of a mountain that is buried in snow for most of the year, there is a circle of stones about 80 feet across, a cairn at the center. 28 spokes running outward like the ribs of a wheel. 6 more cairns spaced around the rim, each one large enough to hold a seated human being. Nobody knows who built it. That is not a dramatic flourish. That is the actual state of the record. And the reason it stays that way is that the people whose homeland surrounds that mountain, the Apsáalooke, the people we call the Crow, have never claimed it. Their tradition says the opposite. Their tradition says the wheel was already standing when they got there, built by ancient ancestors, built by people without iron. That last phrase is the one that should stop you, because it is not a poetic description, it is a dating method. And when you follow it, it leads somewhere strange. To understand why that sentence matters, you have to understand who was saying it and how they came to be standing on that mountain in the first place. The Apsáalooke did not originate in Wyoming. Their own history is explicit about this, and so is the archaeological and linguistic record, which is rarer than you would think. Their language belongs to the Siouan family, closely related to Hidatsa, close enough that the earlier forms were mutually intelligible. Their ancestors lived along the upper Missouri River, in earth lodges, growing corn and beans and squash on the floodplains. They were farmers. Then some of them stopped being farmers and walked west and kept walking for generations. Most migrations in history are pushed. A stronger enemy arrives, a climate shifts, a food source collapses. What makes this one unusual is that the Apsáalooke have never described it that way. They describe it as a search. They were looking for a specific thing in a place they had not yet seen, on the instruction of a vision. And the place they eventually stopped was the place with the wheel on it. It begins with 2 brothers and 2 dreams. Their names come down to us as No Intestines and Red Scout, though the first is often rendered No Vitals, and in Apsáalooke, he is Shipditash. This is the middle of the 1400s. The 2 of them fasted at a lake, and each received a vision. Red Scout was given a kernel of corn. His instruction was to plant it, to stay, to build a life on the bluffs above the river. He did. His people became the Hidatsa, and they are still there in the historical record as farmers of the upper Missouri. No Vitals was given something else, a pod of sacred tobacco seeds, and an instruction to travel west until he found the high country where those seeds would grow. He was told that when the seeds flourished, his people would flourish with them. So one brother stayed and became a farming nation, and the other walked away into the west with about 500 people and a handful of seeds. What followed took generations, not years. Generations. The Apsáalooke keep a chief list, and you can read the migration in it like a ledger. No Intestines in the mid-1400s. One Eye and Raven Face in the late 1400s. Paints his shirt red in the early 1500s. Red Fish in the mid-1500s, during whose leadership the people came to control obsidian sources in what is now Yellowstone. Running Coyote in the late 1500s, who developed the buffalo jump. One Heart in the early 1600s, when the population had grown and the people were prosperous. They went north into what is now Alberta and lived there a while. They came back down. By one account, they traveled to Canada twice before they found what they were looking for. And they did all of it on foot because they had no horses. The horse does not enter Apsáalooke life until the late 1600s under Young White Buffalo. Now here is the detail that reframes everything. That same leader, Young White Buffalo, is the one credited with something else. During his time, the Apsáalooke obtained their first steel knives, traded from the Hidatsa relatives they had left behind. Read that again, and then read the tradition again. The wheel was built by people without iron. That statement comes from a people who kept precise track of when they themselves got iron, and who placed that moment in the late 1600s, generations after they had already arrived at the mountain. They were not saying the builders were primitive, they were saying the builders came before. In 1972, an astronomer climbed the mountain and the argument changed completely. His name was John Eddy, a solar physicist, and in 1974 he published his findings in the journal Science under the title Astronomical Alignment of the Bighorn Medicine Wheel. What he had done was simple in concept. He sat in one cairn and sighted across another, and recorded where on the distant horizon that line landed. The first result was the one everybody remembers. Sight from cairn E across cairn O, and you are looking at the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the summer solstice. Sight from cairn C across cairn O, and you are looking at where it sets on the same day. One of those alignments is accurate to within 1/3 of a degree. At 9,600 feet on a mountain you can only reach for a few months a year, somebody had built a solstice marker. But Eddy did not stop there, and this is where it gets stranger. He checked the winter solstice. Nothing. He checked the equinoxes. Nothing. He checked the moon. Nothing. Then he checked bright stars, and 3 of the remaining cairn pairs lit up. Sirius, Aldebaran, Rigel. Not their positions in the sky generally, but their heliacal risings. The heliacal rising of a star is its first appearance in the dawn sky after a season of invisibility, and it is one of the most precise calendar events available to the naked eye, because it happens on the same date every year without fail, and the 3 stars form a sequence. Later work by the astronomer Jack Robinson added a 4th, Fomalhaut. Put them in order and you get a countdown and a count-off around the solstice. Fomalhaut rises 28 days before. Aldebaran rises in the 2 days just before it. Rigel rises 28 days after. Sirius rises 28 days after that, at the end of August, marking the end of the high mountain summer and the time to go down. 28 days, 28 spokes. Eddy ran the probability of that many alignments occurring by chance and put the ODDS at worse than 1 in 4,000. But the stars raised a problem, and the problem is the whole reason this story is not settled. Stars drift. The Earth wobbles on its axis over a 26,000-year cycle, and that wobble slowly changes where on the horizon a given star will rise, which means a stellar alignment is a clock. It works for a window of a few centuries, and outside that window it degrades. Eddy's stellar alignments work best between roughly 1200 and 1700 AD. That should settle it. Except it does not, for 2 reasons. The first is that the solar alignments do not have that problem. The solstice points barely move. A solstice marker built 5,000 years ago still works today. Only the star sightlines carry a date, and only some of the cairns are star sightlines. The second reason is underground. When the central cairn was examined, it turned out to extend below the level of the wheel, buried under wind-blown dust that had accumulated around it. The oldest part of the structure is the part beneath the structure, which raises the possibility that the wheel we see is not the original, that it is the latest version of something that was rebuilt, added to, and redressed on the same spot across a very long span of time. And there is a comparison case. In Saskatchewan, there is another wheel, at Moose Mountain, with the same stellar targets. It has been dated to roughly 2,000 years old. It is so similar to Bighorn that some researchers have argued it was the model. If that is right, then the tradition of building these things did not begin in 1200 AD. It arrived there, already old. Not everyone accepts this. The archaeologist Ian Brace has pushed back on the astronomical reading, pointing out practical problems with actually taking sightlines across the terrain. The debate is genuine, and it is unresolved. That is worth saying plainly, because the honest version of this story is more interesting than the tidy one. Here is where 2 completely different ways of knowing arrive at the same place. An oral tradition, carried by a people who walked from North Dakota to Wyoming over roughly 2 centuries, says the wheel was standing when they got there, and that the builders had no iron. An astronomer with a theodolite and a precession calculation says the stone sightlines were laid out for a sky that existed before 1700 AD, and that the cairn at the center is older than the circle around it. Neither of those was produced with the other in mind. Eddy was not trying to confirm Apsáalooke tradition. The Apsáalooke were not trying to anticipate archaeoastronomy. They are separate instruments pointed at the same object, and they are not contradicting each other. That is not proof. It is important to be exact about this. Oral tradition is not a stratigraphic layer, and a star alignment is not a signature. The Apsáalooke tradition does not tell us who the builders were. It tells us they were not the Apsáalooke. That is a negative claim, and negative claims are hard to convert into positive ones. But notice what nobody is doing. In 7,000 years of documented human use of that mountain, across the dozens of nations who go there, no nation claims to have built the wheel. Not the Crow, not the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Lakota, the Shoshone. Around 60 tribes visit the site annually and conduct something on the order of 180 ceremonies there every year, and the ownership question that you would expect to generate is simply absent. Everyone treats it as inherited, and the mountain itself supports that. The wheel is not alone up there. It sits inside a complex of sites that represents about 7,000 years of continuous use. Vision Quest enclosures, sweat lodge sites, altars, places where specific medicinal and ceremonial plants are gathered. The wheel is the most visible thing on Medicine Mountain, but it was never the only thing, and it may never have been the point. In 1994, the argument stopped being about the past. The medicine wheel sits on federal land inside the Bighorn National Forest, which means it sits inside a management framework designed for timber, minerals, and recreation. In August of 1994, the Forest Service signed a programmatic agreement that temporarily suspended new mining and timber harvesting within 2.5 miles of the wheel. In September of 1996, it adopted a full historic preservation plan, negotiated with a coalition of Plains tribes, state and local government, and other parties. The plan closed a road and established an area of consultation covering 18,000 acres. It was described at the time as a model for the permanent protection of American Indian Holy Lands on public land. In 1999, a timber company sued to overturn it. Wyoming sawmills had been the primary purchaser of timber from that forest for more than 30 years. Represented by the Mountain States Legal Foundation, they argued that the plan converted multiple-use forest land into a special zone existing solely to foster Native American religion, and that this violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The government, in other words, was accused of establishing a religion by declining to log a mountain. The Medicine Wheel Coalition intervened. In December of 2001, Judge Alan Johnson ruled against the timber company. In September of 2004, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that ruling. The Supreme Court declined to take it up. And this is not history either. The Medicine Wheel Coalition's tribal historic preservation officers have recently proposed updating that plan, and the local county commission has come out against the changes. 30 years on, the same fight is still running. The Apsáalooke never claimed to know who built it. That is, in the end, the most striking thing about this whole story. It would have cost them nothing to claim it. It is in the heart of their country, on the mountain where their migration ended, and a people who had walked for 200 years looking for a home could easily have folded the monument into the founding story. Plenty of nations, in plenty of places, have done exactly that. They did not. They said it was already there. They said the builders had no iron, and then they kept using it anyway, for something like 400 years, alongside everyone else. So we are left with three things that do not resolve into one thing. A structure whose stone sightlines encode a solstice that has not moved, and a set of stars that have. A tradition that says, precisely and consistently, that its keepers found it rather than made it. And a mountain that has been in continuous ceremonial use for 7 millennia, still snowed in most of the year, still reached by a road that closes. Maybe better dating will eventually pull an answer out of that central cairn. Maybe it will confirm what the Apsáalooke have been saying since before there was a Wyoming to say it in. Maybe it will complicate it. Or maybe the answer was never going to be a name. Maybe the honest answer is the one the tradition already gives, which is that somebody stood on that mountain, watched Aldebaran come up ahead of the longest day of the year, and laid 28 lines of stone to hold what they had learned. And then they were gone, and the only thing they left was the instrument. The crow arrived and found it working. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more investigations like this one. And I want to hear from you. Do you think the Apsáalooke tradition and the astronomical evidence are describing the same builders or two different chapters of the same mountain? Tell me in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.